And welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. I'm Andrew Kraft. We have a live picture there at the White House, far away from Washington in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. Senior American and Russian officials, including the country's top diplomats, will hold talks on improving their ties and negotiating an end to the war in Ukraine. This would be the most significant meeting between the sides since Moscow's full-scale invasion of its neighbor nearly 3 years ago. Fox News correspondent Alex Hogan with more in London.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio arriving in Saudi Arabia's capital Monday, a day ahead of high-stakes talks to discuss ending Russia's nearly 3-year war in Ukraine.
The fact that they're meeting tomorrow is really about trying to confirm, is Putin really serious about these negotiations? He said yes to the president. But we also know that Putin has some pretty unrealistic demands.
This after President Trump Sunday said he's currently in the process of trying to get peace, adding he believes Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin wants to bring the war to an end.
I think he wants to end it, and they want to end it fast.
Yet Ukraine's president says his government has not been invited, warning he will not accept the outcome if Ukraine doesn't take part.
There is no any leader in the world who can really make a deal with Putin without us, about us.
Also left out of talks, European allies. French President Emmanuel Macron announcing an emergency summit to be held among European leaders Monday in Paris. This as the Trump administration insists it's working to strike a peace deal.
President Trump is rethinking the entire dynamic here. That has some people uncomfortable, but I think Zelensky would be very wise to enter into this agreement.
Russia's foreign minister insists there is no role for Europe in peace talks. Meantime, the UK's prime minister says he is ready to send British peacekeepers to Ukraine if and when the war ends. In London, Alex Hogan, Fox News.
Alex, thanks so much. Let's talk about all of these dynamics even further with our friend there at the Foundation for Defensive Democracies, analyst John Hardie. He joins me. John, good to see you. And we've talked about this conflict before. I can't believe we're nearing the 3-year mark when it all began. And during the Biden administration, the slogan, the theme was nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And so now, as these talks get underway in Riyadh with the United States and Russia, Rubio and Lavrov, where is Ukraine? And where is Europe? And why are they not at the table? And should they be there?
Well, thanks for having me on. I think that principle you mentioned, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, absolutely needs to hold over the course of these negotiations. This preliminary meeting, the fact that the Ukrainians and Europeans aren't there for this one, perhaps not ideal, but if they're there at the negotiating table in general down the road, I think that's okay. I think this talk is really a feeler to see, how serious the Russians are. I think on the Russian side, they want to sort of get the ball rolling on the negotiating process, start getting the two sides' diplomatic missions up, back and running, and get a feel for who on the U.S. side is going to be leading this.
So would you categorize these talks between the U.S. and Russia as more of a restoration of our own relations with Russia and Ukraine will be brought up in them? Because, to the point in Alex Hogan's report, these high-level talks have not been held between Russia and the United States since the full-scale invasion began. President Biden met with Putin, I believe, in the summer of 2021 in Geneva. And since then, and since the phone call Trump had with Putin, there had been no contact between a U.S. president and a Russian president. And now their foreign ministers will be in Riyadh talking about ending the war without one of the main fighters in the war. And that, of course, is Ukraine. I want to put this statement up here. This is from Mike McFaul, former U.S. ambassador to Russia. He says, I hope we're not witnessing Yalta 2.0 in Saudi Arabia. He says, I fear we are. Is that hyperbolic, or does he have a point?
Well, I think that the Ukrainians and Europeans do have some understandable concern about that potentiality down the road. I think to say that this meeting itself will lead to a Yalta 2 is just very premature. This is, like I said, a very preliminary meeting.
But the Yalta 2.0 reference, if you could explain what McFaul meant by that and the after effects of Yalta during World War II and how that kind of changed the global order and the geopolitical map. And to McFaul's point, if Ukraine and if Europe are not going to be at the table for this very first meeting, this high-level meeting, how can they be assured that they will be at future meetings going forward? And with what Zelensky is saying, John, if this is a non-starter, if anything that is discussed or agreed upon at these meetings are going to be taken to Zelensky there in Kyiv, he's going to reject them outright. He's already said that. So what's the point of this first foray, so to speak?
Yeah, so for the audience who may not be familiar, basically the concern is that the United States and Russia would sort of come to a deal and kind of divide up spheres of influence in Europe over the heads of the Europeans and the Ukrainians. The references to a World War II meeting where the U.S., British, and Soviet leaders kind of did the same. I think here, absolutely, the Ukrainians have to be at the table. I think it's helpful to have a European input too, and ideally a European representative who can kind of speak for European concerns at the table as well. I think President Zelensky is absolutely right. If this agreement is not in line with what he is willing to do, and is not something that a Ukrainian leader can actually implement, that he has the wherewithal and the political kind of leeway to implement. It's not something that's political suicide, as many of Russia's kind of maximalist demands would be. If that's not the case, then this deal is going to be dead. It's going to be, like, for Moscow. It's interesting that both sides see the Minsk agreements, which preceded this full-scale war, right, and it tried to end the previous war. Both sides see that as a failure. And so, but they're also, making demands that are mutually inconsistent.
So are you concerned, though, by the Trump administration, Secretary of State Rubio, just the mere fact of getting to sit across from Russia at a table, that Russia didn't have to give anything to get there? There was no cost that Russia had to give in order to, jumpstart these negotiations on settlement talks with Ukraine. What did they give? What was the high cost, if any?
Well, I don't know that there needs to be a concession to have a preliminary meeting. I mean, at the end of the day, if you want to get a peace deal, you're going to have to talk. So, that's going to, I think if you're talking about, say, a Trump-Putin summit, that should not, in my opinion, happen until there's, been some genuine progress. And you kind of need the leader level summit to maybe push you over a certain hurdle. Okay. But I think this talk is, very preliminary. They're going to have to be face-to-face discussions. I think the issue is not so much, what the Russians had to give up to get this meeting. It's that, what we discussed earlier with the representation of the Ukrainians and the Europeans.
No, I thought that was really interesting. I mean, some are describing not the meetings in Riyadh, but just the phone call between Trump and Putin as some type of Rubicon crossing moment with regard to U.S. support for Ukraine. Do you see it that way or no?
I think, for better or worse, President Trump likes to have he likes to conduct these negotiations through personal relations with his counterpart. I think when it comes to Russia, there's some value in that the Russian, it's a personalist authoritarian system. So what the person at the top, thinks and says is really, really important. And so, I don't see a ton of harm in doing that. I think that the bigger problem, to tack on to what I was saying earlier, is that prior to that call, there was no coordination with Zelensky. The Europeans were blindsided, and I hope that trend will not continue.
So for you who are watching this and these talks unfold this week, what do you think will come out of the talks? Do you think there will be any kind of concrete action item, or is it just the mere fact that they're talking? Can they claim that as a victory?
Right. So I think one thing that could come out of it is an agreement to unwind some of the restrictions that both sides have placed on each other's diplomatic missions. Another thing on Ukraine, you could have kind of an agreement to meet some more. I don't think there'll be any sort of substantive agreements on any sort of peace deal with Ukraine. That is way too early for that. I think right now we'd be agreeing to keep talking.
All right, John Hardie there with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. John, thanks so much for your time and for your insight as well. We'll see you soon.